Reaction then now from Laurie McFarlane, who's an economist at the New Economics Foundation, and also joining us from central London is Ali Renison, who's head of Europe and trade policy at the Institute of Directors. Welcome to both of you. Laurie, to you first of all. We got from Theresa May a few details, didn't we, or a few ambitions at the very least. She said that she wanted Britain to have the greatest possible access to the single market, to have an agreement with the customs union while remaining gaining control of our borders as well. What's your reaction to that? How might the economy fare under those kind of deals?
Well, I think the speech from Theresa May today set out the clearest vision we've had yet as to how she sees the UK's future outside the European Union. Of course, on the one hand, it wasn't all that surprising. Certainly the implicit, if not explicit, indications over the past few months have certainly been that we're heading towards exiting the single market and also the customs union as well. I think there remains a lot of uncertainties around the detail, obviously, with the free trade agreements and also the future arrangements to do with customs. One thing I think it's important to highlight, which I think is slightly worrying, is the Prime Minister's kind of threatening the European Union that if the government doesn't get what they want, then there's a willingness to sort of transform the UK into a sort of a low regulation, low tax offshore haven. I think this won't go down well in Europe, and it certainly isn't the interests of people within the UK. And I think this kind of strategy is quite high risk, and there's a real risk that it backfires. And of course, if it does backfire, it will be those who can afford it least who will end up suffering the most.
OK, just to pick you up on that point of that low tax, that tax haven threat, if you like. Why do you think that's bad for the UK?
Well, I think the evidence is quite clear. If the Prime Minister decides to use the UK's tax-funded public services and hard-won rights as effectively a bargaining chip in the negotiations, then we could end up with quite a radical transformation of the UK's economy, which certainly wouldn't be the interests of most people, working people up and down the country. That's something that a low-tax regime at a time, particularly when the UK's NHS is experiencing a humanitarian crisis due to lack of funding, would resemble nothing more than an ideological drive, really, to fundamentally reshape the UK's economic model and substantially weaken the level of public service provision that the UK has become accustomed to.
OK, Ali Renison, what do you make of the speech then? What will business leaders make of what Theresa May proposes?
Well, I think that Laurie's right. This is by no means surprising, and I think the Prime Minister was right to say to some extent we have to take on face value the statements of the other EU leaders saying no cherry pecking within the single market. So, particularly given the time constraints that Article 50 sets out, it would be perhaps unwise to go down the route of trying to create some controls to free movement and then, upon not being able to sort of succeed in those negotiations, go down the route of a free trade negotiation. So on sort of process issues, it's probably quite a good idea to try and go for the optimal outcome in terms of a free trade arrangement. But there are certainly quite a few question marks around transitional arrangements still. I think the Prime Minister was very right when she talked about providing some phased implementation for once the agreement is done. But it's not clear about whether she was saying the entire FTA would be done within 2 years, and if not, what is the transitional period to sort of continue on with those negotiations until the agreement is concluded?
That's right, Ali Renison. She talked about this phasing in of changes after the negotiation was complete. But do you welcome that in principle? Is that helpful for businesses to avoid that so-called cliff edge when the deal is struck and tariffs potentially could be forced in on the next day?
Absolutely. I think one of the issues with having a bespoke arrangement is that it's a little bit harder for businesses to plan for than an off-the-shelf model, so to speak. And if the EU goes down the route of then nothing is agreed until the last minute, until everything is agreed, then you don't know the actual shape of the negotiations. You need that time period afterwards, not just for bankers in the city, but for traders who are not used to dealing with customs declarations to adjust to the new paperwork that they might have to deal with. And not to mention as well, HMRC and other parts of government infrastructure need the time to adjust to their systems as well.
Laurie McFarlane, one of the main points that Theresa was making about leaving the single market but having access to it was the fact that Britain could then strike its own trade deals with countries outside the EU. Do you agree that that could make a huge difference to the economy? The people who are pro-Brexit would argue that there are economies out there that are growing a lot faster than the EU, and that's where Britain could really make some money.
Certainly a key plank of the Prime Minister's approach set out today by explicitly not seeking membership of the single market or the customs union is to have the ability to agree free trade deals with other parts of the world. Now, clearly, they may bring some opportunities, but certainly the evidence is clear that that's no replacement for being a member of the single market. The reality is, when it comes to trade, distance still matters significantly. And while there may be opportunities in some emerging markets, overwhelmingly the most valuable market for the UK to be trading in is still with its European partners in the European Union.
So, Ali Renison, does that worry you at all? Do you think businesses in the round will lose out?
Well, I think Laura is right to say that we shouldn't assume that in the immediate period after Brexit that new trade deals is going to compensate for any massive sort of loss in trade with the EU. But I think we have to remember that one of the things that he picked up on was we're going to have to leave the EU's customs union. The EU's customs union, which is different to being in a customs union with the EU, like Turkey, is only open to EU member states. So we're going to have to leave that anyways. The question around customs cooperation is separate from the common external tariff. So I think Theresa May is right when she says that there are arrangements that can be made to minimise customs checks going forward.
And what about how feasible all of this is? This is really Theresa May laying out what she wants to achieve, Laurie. Do you think that it's likely to be agreed on by the 27 other European nations?
Well, I think that's the key question, because Theresa May has been very clear that she's not seeking an off-the-shelf model which would allow a much quicker agreement. She's looking for something that's very bespoke, that's likely going to need long, intense negotiations with European partners. I think it's highly unlikely that they are going to come to some kind of agreement within the 2-year time period. And although she set out a vision for some sort of phased transition, the detail on that is very light. And I think this is what is really going to make or break the future of the UK's relationship, is how these negotiations are going to happen in this transition phase, and what this transition phase is going to look like and how long it's going to last.
OK, and Ali Renison, finally, I do want to ask you about controlling Britain's borders, because that's something that the government has talked quite a lot about, hasn't it? What does that mean for businesses? Are you confident that Britain's businesses will be able to hire the people they want under these new kind of rules?
Well, interestingly enough, actually, going down the route of a free trade agreement actually allows for more flexibility in negotiations on labour mobility, because you're not trying to introduce sort of new controls onto an existing model like free movement. Having said that, the concern is we need to make sure that there is some preferential level taking into account the history of ties, economic and political, between the UK and the EU, that makes sure that the EU is given some preferential treatment on labour mobility going forward.
OK, we must leave it there. Ali Renison of the Institute of Directors and Laurie McFarlane, thank you both very much indeed.